Hello all and welcome to another Hyperblue Reviews. Today's review is going to cover an indie RPG called Takeshi and Hiroshi. Does this game slash its way into the hearts of many, or is it a smoldering mess? Let's find out. Takeshi and Hiroshi is an indie RPG that was developed and published by Oink Games. I've never heard of Oink Games before, but apparently they have been around for about 10 plus years. The logo actually reminds me of the Pigmask Army from Mother 3. Well, in any case, Oink Games was known for their board games prior to dipping their toes in the mobile gaming market. That being said, Takeshi and Hiroshi is available on mobile and for the Nintendo Switch. For this review, I'm focusing on the Nintendo Switch version. Let's talk about the plot. The story of Takeshi and Hiroshi is actually rather heartwarming. You see, Takeshi and Hiroshi are brothers. Takeshi is the eldest brother in the family, and he is designing a video game for his little brother Hiroshi. The game is called Mighty Warrior, and is an RPG with random generated enemies that are chosen by the player. Hiroshi wants to always play Takeshi's game, but Takeshi has trouble keeping up with the development of his game. And that actually sounds kind of familiar. Anyway, Takeshi does let Hiroshi play his unfinished game, but in order for Hiroshi to progress, Takeshi has control of the enemies. Hiroshi isn't aware of this though, at least it doesn't seem like he is. Hiroshi absolutely loves playing the game and wants to play more and more. Hiroshi is also plagued with really bad asthma. It's so bad that he actually has to be hospitalized for it for a few days. Takeshi burns the midnight oil in order to create new levels for Hiroshi to play in order to lift his spirit. To Takeshi, he is the game. For Hiroshi, Takeshi is an awesome brother. The game always seems to do the trick to lift Hiroshi's spirit, so Takeshi works as hard as he can to finish it. Takeshi even goes through character development throughout the game where he realizes that he may not know enough programming in order to complete his game for his little brother. So, he asks for help for one of his classmates who is also a game developer. This is juxtaposed with his earlier stance that he needed to make the entire game by himself because he felt that it was his duty or obligation. I like to get into quick spoilers on the game's ending, so you've been warned. Takeshi's classmate, Yasuke, helps Takeshi come up with a story and an endgame for Mighty Warrior. After all, if there's no conflict, then it sounds like a pretty boring RPG. A dragon is introduced in Chapter 4 that completely obliterates the player when it first arrives. As one would expect, the final boss is said dragon. The dragon is supposed to represent a hardship for Hiroshi to overcome, like his asthma. While Takeshi is programming his heart out for his little brother, Hiroshi was also getting better in the hospital. So much so that, well, he was cleared to go home. Hiroshi even throws a hissy fit when he hears he has to go back to school. I mean, I didn't like going to school when I was his age either, but, get over it. Regardless, he needs a little moral boost to help get him motivated enough to leave the hospital. That moral boost comes from beating the dragon. When Hiroshi manages to defeat the dragon, he states that he will always fight like a hero. The game ends there, so we don't know if he decides to stop whining about school, but I suppose one can infer that he did. Alright, that's enough of the spoilers. So the story can get a bit emotional, but how does the game play? The main game that the player actually interacts with is Takeshi's Mighty Warrior game. Mighty Warrior plays like this. The player selects from 1 to 6 monsters for the hero to fight. The more damage the hero takes, the more his stress increases. This is actually a good thing in Mighty Warrior though. You see, the player has 5 rounds to raise Hiroshi's overall excitement. His excitement increases for any positive stress that the player gets after each battle. Raising stress sounds counterintuitive to raising excitement, but whatever, it's a game. There are 7 chapters in Takeshi and Hiroshi, and in each of them, the player has to reach a certain amount of excitement. As one would expect, the monsters get tougher and tougher to kill as the game progresses. That can be used to your benefit though, because Hiroshi's excitement will not increase if he defeats the monsters too quickly. In fact, Hiroshi's excitement can actually decrease if he beats the monsters too quickly. The player has to select the best combination to maximize stress without killing the hero. There are also new powers and abilities granted to the hero throughout the game. Eventually you meet a wizard that grants you special abilities to use during the fight. Of course, this is an RPG, so the player also needs to watch out for their health as well. If the player dies, then they have to start the level completely over, unless they reached a torch along the way. The torch acts as a checkpoint, so players can start from there if they die. And honestly, that's Takeshi and Hiroshi in a nutshell. Eventually, the player will reach the dragon I mentioned earlier. The dragon is very tough and is honestly unbalanced. It has 3 main attacks, and 2 of them do a lot of damage to the player. The dragon also spams these attacks frequently, so it's very hard to keep the hero's health up during the fight. And that's all Takeshi and Hiroshi has to offer in terms of gameplay. So let's dive a little deeper into the overall game. First off, it's probably important to note that the Mighty Warrior game was designed for a tablet, in the game. So it does ultimately feel like the player is playing a mobile game on the Nintendo Switch. Now, I know I already mentioned that Takeshi and Hiroshi is available on mobile as well, but I didn't realize that before playing it on the Switch. So the fact that this plays like a mobile game kind of makes sense, and I certainly don't mean it as a negative for the game itself. I figured I would just warn players about it, in case they decided to play and didn't know it beforehand. Mobile game feel aside, Takeshi and Hiroshi has a lot going for it in terms of the art style and story. In fact, the art style is what attracted me to the game in the first place. I love claymation, and the claymation in Takeshi and Hiroshi is done very well. I honestly wish the entire game was claymation. The claymation really works with the story as well. The amount of detail that the creators put into the characters' expressions is fantastic. Speaking of the story, it's honestly very touching. The amount of love that Takeshi showed for his brother was nothing short of sweet. The claymation and heartfelt story are honestly the best parts of the game to me. Story and graphics are only part of a game though. There's also gameplay. And the gameplay is what let me down the most here. It's just not that fun. Once you learn the gameplay mechanics, the game becomes really easy to complete. You'll know which combinations to pick and choose and which to avoid. Speaking of, the monsters do seem to be randomly generated each turn, and that can get a bit unfair at times. The player is either left with a combination of enemies that are overpowered, or from a group of enemies that is really weak. Either way, it's a wasted turn. Typically, you can pick the same options over and over given how the random number generator plays out, but there is that rare occasion where the choices just aren't that great. In addition to the Mighty Warrior gameplay, there's also a mini-game that the player can try out when Yasuke is introduced. It's a weird zombie runner type game, and it's completely optional. It's just a weird thing to include in the game, even though it establishes Yasuke as a programmer that Takeshi can turn to later in the game. I guess it also gives the player a minigame to play as well, but again, it's just a weird addition to the overall game. Speaking of Yasuke, I mentioned earlier that there was a bit of character development for Takeshi, but didn't mention what that was. Takeshi acts like a brat throughout the first few chapters to his friend Erika and also Yasuke. I get that Takeshi is concerned for his brother and is also stressed out because of his game, but that doesn't give him the right to be an ass when his friends show some curiosity about what he's making. Takeshi eventually comes around, but only after he realizes that he can't finish the game on his own. So I guess that means he's basically just using the people around him? I mean, I guess he does learn the error of his ways, but it still kind of comes off as Takeshi's only using the people around him. I mentioned that the gameplay was a letdown, and it was, but so is the soundtrack. The music is there. It's minimalistic at best and meh at its worst. Speaking of meh, I already talked about how the game has 7 chapters, but what I didn't mention is that each chapter plays the exact same way, besides the introduction of new gameplay mechanics like the wizard and the dragon. The absolute worst part of the game, though, is that the ending doesn't really have any closure. Erika, Yasuke, and Takeshi stay up late making the final dragon fight to inspire young Hiroshi. After you beat the game, Hiroshi says, "That was so much fun, and I'm always going to fight like a hero." But it didn't really provide any closure for me. Did Hiroshi know that Takeshi was playing with him? He sure seemed like he did throughout the game. That was never addressed, and I just feel like the story would have benefited more with Hiroshi bringing up that he enjoyed the fact that Takeshi was actually playing with him. It would have added more emotion to an already awesome story. With the way the developers left it, it felt unsatisfying. Overall though, Takeshi and Hiroshi does have some things going for it, like the nice story and claymation. But this is a video game we're talking about, so it needs to have some fun gameplay as well. Unfortunately for this game, it doesn't. The levels aren't really that challenging, and the gameplay is repetitive, bordering on boring. That being said, I give Takeshi and Hiroshi 2 pig noses out of 5. Thanks for checking out this review. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, thank you for watching.